I've talked about, obscure players or players who might be kind of easy for casual hockey fans either to not recognize the name of, maybe you forget over the years. And I've kind of stumbled upon this idea for a playlist and for videos going forward. And I know they're not going to generate a lot of views. That's not everything that I do is about views. And it's about, just as a hockey fan, some of the stories that might fall through the cracks. And in this case, you have Eddy Beers. Eddy Beers, who I thought he was a good player. And his disappearance, honestly, I didn't really think about it as a kid. Keep in mind, when he's out of the league in '86, I'm a teenager. I'm entering middle school. I'm not really thinking about Eddy Beers. We didn't have the 24/7 cycle of sports news. And certainly I would have paid more attention at the time. But Eddy Beers is a guy who's notable because he was part of a major trade. And it is a trade that is seen as a huge loss for St. Louis. Part of it is the fact that Eddy Beers' career was cut short. So I want to do videos on players that had their careers cut short. And one that I looked up today, because I remembered back to when I was a kid, and it was one of those ones that really caught people off guard, was Norman Levier. And if you're a Boston fan, you'll know who Norman Levier is. And if you're not, you would look back at that draft, see Norman Levier in the first round and go, well, that was a bust, and not know the whole story. So that's important, I think, sometimes to tell the whole story. Something I did with the Gord Kluzak career video I did ages ago. Because Gord Kluzak's remembered as, number one draft pick and he's a bust. Really wasn't. Just went through a lot of injuries. When he played, he was pretty effective. Eddy Beers. He was signed as a free agent in 1982 at the age of 22, and not a guy who was drafted, and he came out of the University of Denver. So he comes in 81-82, plays 5 games after being signed. 1 goal, 1 assist, 2 points in those 5 games. So in his rookie year, 82-83, plays half the season with Calgary, 41 games, 11 goals, 15 assists, 26 points. In the playoffs, 8 games played, 1 goal, 1 assist, and 2 points. 83-84 is his big year, and this was his breakthrough. 73 games, 36 goals, 39 assists, 75 points. More than a point a game. 11 games played in the playoffs, 2 goals, 5 assists, 7 points. Pretty darn good. 3 hat tricks in 83-84. He also had 16 power play goals that year, which was 7th in the National Hockey League. He was second in scoring on the Calgary Flames to Kent Nilsson. He was the leading scorer for Calgary at certain points, and then Nilsson ends up being the leading scorer. And in 84-85, he was 5th on team scoring. 74 games played, 28 goals, 40 assists, 68 points for him that season. In the playoffs, 3 games played, 1 goal, no assists, 1 point. And of course, that was when we saw Calgary making a change, where they realized they had to make things better for themselves. And they end up moving Nilsson, and Beers would be one of the guys who got moved the following season. So 85-86, 33 games played with Calgary, 11 goals, 10 assists, 21 points. He ends up getting traded to St. Louis. Plays 24 games in St. Louis. After the trade, 7 goals, 11 assists, 18 points. In the playoffs, 19 games played, 3 goals, 4 assists, 7 points. So he gets traded by the Flames to St. Louis and then meets them in the conference finals that year, where for the Flames, they would get to the Stanley Cup finals, where they would lose to the Montreal Canadiens, and for Eddy Beers, against his former teammates, he gets knocked out in the conference finals. He goes from wearing number 27 in Calgary to wearing number 19 in St. Louis. So it is interesting with Eddy Beers. 1983 against Vancouver in the playoffs, he had the overtime winner at 12 minutes and 27 seconds of Game 1. And of course, they would go on and beat Vancouver in the first round that year, and that was revenge for 82, where they lost in the first round, a series where Eddy didn't play. Now, one of the more fascinating storylines in this, he's a 16.3% shooter over his career, 94 goals in 250 games, 116 assists for 210 points. Those are respectable totals. You put those up against some of the better players in the league now, and they would match up very well. And that's where people say, well, yeah, but that was the 80s where everybody was scoring. Fine, but you put him up against some of the guys from the 80s as well. His points totals are pretty good, especially these 2 seasons. And then, of course, here he only played the 57 games. Now, rewinding a bit, March 27th of 1984, against the Vancouver Canucks, he and Harold Snepsts get into it. They both get thrown out of the game. They both get game misconducts. In the process of being kind of angry at Harold Sneps, I would assume for an autograph reason, he throws his stick at Harold Sneps. Probably something along the lines of, hey, Harold, can you sign this for me? Can you kiss this for me? Something. I'm sure there was something he wanted Harold Sneps to do with the stick. It was the 80s. It was a different time. I don't know what exactly he would have been telling Harold, but here we are. So he throws it at Sneps and gets thrown out. But the NHL, when they were looking at the possibility of suspending him, the Canucks didn't want him to get suspended. Eddy Beers, one of the top 2 scorers for the Calgary Flames, they didn't want him suspended because Calgary had an upcoming game against the Winnipeg Jets. Now, what I was reading was that their next game was against the Jets, but I went back and looked in the 83-84 schedule, and it wasn't. Unless that was when the NHL was going to bring down its decision on the suspension. Eddy Beers, after that game, had almost no scoring. I think he had 1 assist in the last 4 games of the year that year for Calgary. So he was getting a bit frustrated. But it is interesting that the Canucks were saying, don't suspend him, because the Canucks were up against the Jets. The Canucks and the Jets ended up tied in points with 73 that year. Vancouver beats them out and wins. Vancouver gets the joy of losing to Calgary, while Winnipeg had the joy of losing to Edmonton as a result. So Vancouver doesn't want to play Edmonton in the first round, and they're saying, hey, don't suspend Beers. Don't you do it, because they'd rather play Calgary than Edmonton, which probably works to their detriment anyways, because Calgary's like, really, you want to face us? Okie dokie then. But it is interesting because Eddy Beers in his career against Winnipeg, of his 250 games played, 21 of them are against the Winnipeg Jets. 16 goals, 11 assists, 27 points. Now, in that game against Winnipeg, Eddy doesn't get on the board, and Winnipeg wins the game 3-2. But as I said, they end up tied with the Canucks. So it's okay. The Canucks still end up finishing ahead of Winnipeg by virtue of more wins. But it was close. Now, after the infamous trade, he ends up being out of the game. But the infamous trade is one that we've talked about in hockey circles since it was made. He was traded with Gino Cavallini and Charlie Bourgeois to St. Louis for Joe Mullen, Rick Wilson, and Terry Johnson. Now, when you're traded and one of the guys going the other way is Joe Mullen, that's probably a sign it's going to be a trade that goes against your team. As Calgary trades Joe Mullen then to Pittsburgh, and that doesn't work out for them and works out great for Pittsburgh. But you have to ask yourself, with Eddy Beers' numbers here, 18 points in 24 games, you project that out, it's what, about 60 points? So at worst, if he had played the following season, he probably would have had about 60 points. You add that with Gino Cavallini, who was a decent forward for the St. Louis Blues. Charlie Bourgeois, who had potential at the time as well. As lopsided as that trade looks, what makes the trade bad is what happened in training camp. September 23rd, 1986. He hurts his back during practice in Peoria, and he ended up having a disc removed from his back. Now, that's, no matter what you do at that point, the odds of you playing again, they're limited. And so after he had the disc removed, and he did his best to rest and try to heal it up, no amount of rest would help. So Eddy Beers had to declare, I give up, I'm done, I'm going to cry uncle here because I'm not coming back. And he did not return to the game. So what makes that trade for Joe Mullen look really, really bad, in part is he gets injured in training camp. He doesn't play a full career. He's done in 86. This is why I'm doing the video on this, because it's one of those fascinating little details. If you're under the age of, I'll go ahead and say under the age of 40, you'd look at this trade and go, all he got was Cavallini, Bourgeois, and Beers. Who's Beers? I don't know who that is. So again, he was a good player. And at the time, I'm sure that St. Louis was thinking, well, we're adding Cavallini, we're adding Bourgeois. Johnson, does he a star? No. Rick Wilson? Not really. So to them, to St. Louis at the time, it would look like this was a decent enough trade. It just so happens that the Beers didn't play again after that injury. He played 250 games, as I said, in the playoffs, 41 games played, 7 goals, 10 assists, 17 points. So his points per game in the playoffs were low, relatively speaking, but the Flames had their troubles getting over the hump. I guess then the question becomes one of, I talked about Nilsson and how the Flames wanted to change their identity. Was this a matter of the Flames looking at Eddy Beers and going, we like him, he's a good player, but we think Mullen's a giant upgrade, and we're willing to go out on a limb with that? Or was this a matter of St. Louis saying, we like this kid, he's probably pretty good? Remember, at the time they trade for him, he's still in his mid-20s. So he's not an old player, he's in his mid-20s. And again, if not for the back injury, who knows? So that's one of the reasons I'm doing these videos, is for the whole who knows factor of it. And I'll put together as much information on here as possible. And for Eddy, he would go on to coach in the BC Junior League with Kelowna, Chilliwack, and Merritt. Kelowna while they were in the BC Junior League. So he did coach in Chilliwack, so I sort of have a vague memory of that too. And again, that's part of the reason why I want to do these videos. So there you go. The career of Eddy Beers. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And yep, don't be surprised if I am looking through and trying to find as much content as possible on players that had shortened careers. And I'm not talking about like Mario Lemieux and Eric Lindros. I'm talking about the guys that didn't really garner all that attention because maybe they didn't play long enough or something else took place, and I'll cover it here. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.